Hi guys, in today's video I'll focus on the top 10 cards I consider to be flavor fails, and I'll further explain my reasons behind each decision. Before we begin, I gotta be honest. The vast majority of Magic cards are quite flavorful, thus it was really hard to compile this list, but I had a blast nonetheless. Coming up at number 10 we have an obvious choice, Omniscience. To be omniscient means to be all-knowing, which in turn would imply one of two things. The first is having access to your entire knowledge of spells, or in other words, your library, and likely having no limit to your hand size, akin to the effects of spells like Enter the Infinite, or perhaps even Finale of Revelation. On the other hand, all-knowing could extend to your opponents as well, having knowledge to their thoughts and memories, in an effect similar to Mind's Dilation. Also take a look at the flavor text. Infinite wisdom cannot be contained within a single mind. Infinite wisdom, you say? As is the card Omniscience is closer to Omnipotence, which means all-powerful, and would fit better given how it allows you to cast spells from your hand without paying their mana cost. The name Tectonic Reformation would imply that the lands being reformed are already in play, however the card cares about the lands in hand, which before being played are mere thoughts of lands that the player has visited and or bonded to himself. Even more confusing is the art and the flavor text. On the picture we see a seemingly despondent woman on her knees, surrounded in a circle of fire amid otherwise empty and quite desolate landscape. The flavor text however reads, "Alone in the charred desolation of her kingdom, she regretted many things, most of all not acting sooner." First off, in the art we see barren mountainous landscape, and not ruins or remnants of a kingdom. Second of all, it would appear that she regretted many things, most of all not acting sooner part, is alluding to the fact that she held on to the thoughts for too long, decided to cycle them away for answers at some point, but it was too little too late, and now they are gone. Let me get this straight. In order to preserve her kingdom, meaning her lands, she discarded them away to find answers, and is now sad that the lands are lost and became only a memory that is currently sitting in the graveyard.
Not a great plan.
At first look, Agonizing Remorse looks like any other discard spell. You are reaching into your opponent's thoughts or memories and remove something. But, and there is always a but, let's look at the name and the flavor text. The sharp memory of Daxus's death stabbed into Elspeth's soul. This implies that both the memory and the pain is felt by Elspeth, or in this case the owner of the card that is being exiled. However, it is you who is losing the life, not your opponent. Believe it or not, this flavor fail is repeated again in the Strixhaven Mystical Archives version as well. Guilt is not absolution, regret is not justice, but it is right that you suffer. Basically, the owner of the guilt and regret is the one who should suffer, but once again it is you who loses one life instead of the opponent, who owns the card that is being exiled. Additionally, feeling remorse, guilt, etc. over something by itself implies that you should remember it in order to continue feeling guilty. However, this spell exiles the card instead of discarding it, and exile is a zone signifying complete and total oblivion. The name Memory Deluge implies a flood of past memories that is pouring into the mind of the caster, and we see this depicted in the art as well. Presented in the form of Pentaptych, we see a mother who recollects the series of tragic events where she walks with her daughter, who was apparently bit by a vampire and suddenly turns and attacks her. The woman is left with no other choice but to defend herself, destroy the abomination that her child had become, and then even bury it herself. The art composition is reminiscent of Chandra's spellbook art for Past in Flames, where we see the past memories of the titular character depicted once again in the form of Pentaptych. The key word here is past, as both cards depict recollecting events that have already happened, but Memory Deluge focus on digging through the library, which, as I have already discussed in another video, represents either the future or the entire knowledge that a player has, and never the past memories which are located in the graveyard. The only connection Memory Deluge has with the past is that it can be cast from the graveyard for its flashback cost, but that is not enough to save it from appearing on this list. Teferi's Protection, everyone's favorite white protection spell. The card depicts the moment Teferi fades out his homeland of Zhalfir in order to save it from Phyrexian invasion. A futile effort. All will be one. The problem is that the Zhalfir rift was closed by Jeska. The lands of Zhalfir that were phased out were irreversibly lost and cannot phase back in, at least in the current lore. But instead of having a similar effect to Disciple of Kelos Nin, which phases permanents out and stops them from phasing back in, Teferi's Protection only lasts one turn rotation. One can argue that the card depicts the moment Teferi casts the spell, with the implied intent to phase the lands back as soon as he could, but even in the lore, it has been some 300 years before he even came back to Dominaria, long after the invasion had ended. Up next is Ryonia, Fire Dancer. Let us read quickly through the little official lore that we have on her. Prismari students are free to do projects alone or in groups. Ryonia was the first to choose both. She has little patience for explaining her vision to others, but there is one collaborator who will always follow her choreography in perfect harmony, herself. This is definitely an interesting character whose description seems pretty accurate for a red card, with a very little slight hint of blue, but after all she is a Prismari student, so that is expected. Next is the art, where we see Ryonia dancing with two short swords, surrounded by fairy clones of herself. Finally, we take a look at the ability, and now we can see a problem. The rules explicitly state that Ryonia's ability can only create copies of other creatures, and never herself. Why was this made? If the reason was it would go into geometrical progression with extra combats, why not make the tokens lose this ability, similar to how Mirage Phalanx works, or even make her summon elemental tokens with her stats, implying they are copies of her, but avoiding any such problems. Overall, what I'm trying to say is, when I imagine how a Ryonia board should look like, I think of something like these girls, performing the Korean sword dance Kommu, instead of something like this, whatever that is. Next are Thryn and Silver, but mostly Thryn. I'll admit there is an argument to be made about how she is partnered with the Ragnos Cat Nightmare, but the card is also standalone and can be run as a solo commander. The lore for Thryn and Silver is as follows. Thryn is a bonder from Ikoria, but hides that fact and lives in the human city of Dranit, where she used to be a former Copper Cloak. Nowadays, she is basically an undercover Bonder resistant fighter who disobeys higher authority by working against the established order and just happens to have a habit of luring corrupt officials to where her bonded animal resides, and feeds them to it. No matter how you look at it, she isn't very mono-white. I also have a small gripe with Silver as I struggle to understand why it gets indestructible after eating someone. Wouldn't it be more fitting if it gained hexproof or shroud to signify it has successfully avoided detection, or perhaps even becoming unblockable instead? At first glance, Cruel Reality looks like a very flavorful card. After all, it was selected for a story spotlight. The art is accurate, the name and flavor text as well, but it is on this list because of the card type and ability. First off, let us take a step back and look at the situation. The Gatewatch arrive on Amonkhet, and Gideon is immediately captivated by the fact that the gods of the plane seem so close to the people that they even walk among them, which is a stark contrast to the gods he was used to on Teros. He then decides to participate in the trials to show his renewed faith, but during the trials he discovers the cruel reality of the plane, where those who fall are left behind and those deemed worthy are sacrificed. It was here where he decided to intervene in order to save one of them. All that being said, the card Cruel Reality manages to capture the merciless aspect of the reality on Amonkhet, but fails in its scope. The trials are for everyone. Every living person on the plane lives to die for the chance to serve the god Pharaoh, even beyond death itself. Gideon realizes this grim truth, but the card is an oral curse, presenting the cruel reality of Amonkhet only to the enhanced opponent, and only to a single opponent. If I was to rework the card, I feel it should look something like this. 5 and 2 black for enchantment that reads, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices the creature with the lowest power among creatures that player controls. If the player can't, he or she loses 5 life. The final 2 cards on this list are from Kamigawa. I'll be honest, Kamigawa was the set I started to play Magic regularly, and probably the main reason I stuck with the game for so long. The lore you could find on almost every card was so immersive, like the deeply emotional letters of Sensei Hisoka to Lord Konda, or the great battles of Kamigawa. Even the jankiest of commons, who most people would pass up even in draft, had their value. I've always loved and considered the 3 Kamigawa sets as the epitome of flavor itself, and perhaps it is due to this heartfelt connection, because the bar was set so high, that I placed the top 2 cards I consider as flavor fails to be cards from this set. Without further ado, at number 2 comes none other but Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker. Long-term fan favorite, and the only card I've paid more than €5 for, but flavor fail nonetheless. First off, let's examine the lore. For such a beloved character, Kiki-Jiki actually appears in only one story dating back to ancient times, 2004 to be precise. In the story, he accidentally meets with the dragon spirit Keiga, who tasks the goblin with retrieving his egg that was stolen by the Sorotami ambassador Meloku. The dragon took him to Oboro, palace in the clouds, and Kiki-Jiki successfully infiltrated and later found the egg. Before leaving, however, he caught a glimpse of himself in Meloku's magical mirror, and upon realizing that the reflection was autonomous and mocking him, he decided to break it. In doing so, the reflection came alive, and the two decided to split up in order to escape more easily. Kiki-Jiki managed to do so, but the reflection was caught and soon vanished into the ether. At the end of the story, Keiga tells Kiki-Jiki that his magic is not dependent on Meloku's magical mirror, but on himself, and the goblin hopes that he'll be able to practice more of his newfound powers soon. So when it comes to his card, one would expect that Kiki-Jiki would above all else duplicate himself to create more reflections of himself. This is also implied in a paragraph from the same story. The Ryu had promised to take him to an abandoned orchard he knew of, with lots of overburdened fruit trees and fat snails for the taking. There would be a pool of water there too, thought Kiki-Jiki, a place where he could try out his newfound talents. Kiki-Jiki grinned. Today was turning out to be a pretty good day after all. So let's summarize. A pool of water is a place where he could try out his newfound talents. Sounds suspiciously like looking at his reflection in the water to make it come alive. As we all know though, Kiki-Jiki's card does not allow him to copy himself, but more importantly, it specifically prohibits the copying of legendary creatures. At the same time, the art depicts Kiki-Jiki along with a blue dragon, who while not looking exactly like Keiga, raises an interesting question. Dragons are very rare on Kamigawa, with Keiga being the only one of 2 blue dragons mentioned in the entirety of the block, with the other being a nameless one bound to the legendary sword Tatsumasa. Said dragon is surrounded by a flaming aura of some kind, implying that it is an illusion that Kiki-Jiki had just created. Moreover, the goblin is pointing at a certain direction, as if commanding the dragon spirit to do his bidding. Personally, I don't see a reason why he can't copy legendary creatures, and most importantly himself, with adding 1 mana cost to activate the ability similar to how his reflection works, from that one set that shall not be named. Doing this eliminates the problem of having a 1-card combo by using Kiki-Jiki to make infinite number of tokens of himself at the beginning of the end step before our turn, which would let us keep them and attack with them on our turn. If one must add Ashnod's Salter to enable this combo anyway, it's not like there aren't a million combos already. I mean, even Sparring Mummy can go to town. For number 1, I chose Azami, Lady of Screws. While my gripes with Kiki Jiki's design might seem nitpicky to some, once you get to know Menamo's top librarian, you'll see why she is number 1. Born in Kawabe province, Ozu Azami was a neglected child who preferred the company of books to that of friends. Enjoying to read forbidden texts by the river, she was once visited by a river kami, who she mistook for a much greater spirit. The two made a pact, and Azami promised everything in return for knowledge. A year later, while searching for Azami, who was always missing, her mother fell into the river and got sick. Convinced that this was all part of the river kami's plan and a stepping stone to her greatness, Azami chose to read her scrolls instead of tending to her sick mother, who died soon after. Afterwards, Azami was sent to Minamo, where she met Urano Etsumi. The two became friends, and at some point Azami convinced her to go to Nezumi territory to search for hidden scrolls. Initially successful, the pair was soon discovered and was given chase. However, Etsumi fell into the quicksand pit, but remained calm, convinced that her friend would give her a hand. Azami demanded the scrolls that Etsumi was carrying first, and once she had them, consigned her friend to the pit. She made it out of the swamp safely, with her precious scrolls in hand, and only her friend's desperate cries following her footsteps. At Minamo, Azami soon became rivals with the head librarian Shimazaki. Set on acquiring her position, Azami feigned submission and offered a truce in the form of a picnic. Once there, she served her victim with mushrooms laced with poison. While she herself ate only so much as to make herself ill, Miss Shimazaki was killed after a long and painful illness. Everyone was none the wiser, and soon after her passing, Azami took over her position. However, as fate would have it, during the ensuing Kami Wars, Miss Ozu met once again with the Kami of her youth. It was then when she realized that the spirit had no great powers, and all the deaths that occurred had not been part of some great plan, but of her own doing. But this was also true for her numerous successes. So Azami chose not to mourn the dead, troubled solely by the thought that she had been fooled for so long by such a lesser Kami. During her time as head librarian, Azami became aware of a spirit known only as the Unspeakable, and the dangers of trying to find its name. So instead of doing it herself, she encouraged her students to peer through depths, reach through mists, and sift through sands in order to study their experiences. The ultimate fate of one of Kamigawa's most insidious killers, Miss Ozu Azami, is still unknown, but it is possible that she perished during Hidetsugu's attack on Minamo. Now that we know the lore behind her, we can look at her card. Azami, Lady of Scrolls, is a human wizard that lets you tap an untapped wizard to draw a card. This ability only partially reminiscent to how she let her students study the Unspeakable, but it lacks the long-term effects that would follow such an action. Moreover, she can tap herself, which, assuming the first part is true, would be another flavor fail. There is no sign of her insidious and, dare I say, murderous nature, and instead she is represented as an ordinary librarian, encouraging her students to read schools and acquire knowledge. Then comes her flavor text. Choices belong to those with luxuries of time and distance. We have neither. I recommend we proceed with the plan to destroy all shrines of the kami. First off, her letter implies the necessity for speed, but her card taps wizards to symbolically send them to the library to gather knowledge, which as seen by the tap requirements is a slow activity. Second, it urges for the destruction of kami shrines, or the Hondens, but the card's ability has no reference to enchantments or any form of interaction whatsoever. Like was the case with Cure Reality, and because I'm starting to discover that crafting custom cards is quite fun, here is my version of how I imagine a more lore-accurate Azami would look like. Well, this was my list of cards I consider to be mechanical flavor fails. Do you agree with it? What cards do you think are flavor fails? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers!